Hi class, so we are continuing on with the bones of our upper extremity. We've done our pectoral girdle, the clavicle, and the scapula. We've done our humerus. Now we're on to the forearm bones. We have two of them, the ulna and the radius. They are run parallel to each other. Always remember when we're talking about these bones, we're talking about them relative to the anatomical position. So we are always going to say the ulna is the medial bone, the radius is the lateral bone. The radius is always on the thumb side. Always remember that. If you're checking a patient's pulse and it's a radial pulse, you're checking that pulse on the distal end of the radius, and it's always on that thumb side. So we're going to get started with the ulna. We talked about the ulna when we were doing the humerus, and we looked at a lot of the parts of the humerus relative to the ulna. So let's look at the ulna closer. So here is the ulna isolated, all by its lonesome. When you pick up an ulna, if you actually have a bone to look at, first thing, which view is anterior and which view is posterior? This right here, we talked about it with the humerus. This is the ulnar, the trochlear notch of the ulna. So you can see it better when you look at it this way. Looks like a monkey wrench, the whole ulna. We call it the monkey wrench bone. This is the trochlear notch. That is always going to be facing anteriorly. And this projection back in here, let me get this in view. This is the acromion process. Here's the back side of the acromion process. And here is the lip of the acromion process right here. So this acromion process is right here. Here's the trochlear notch. This is the posterior aspect is back in here. This is going to be the anterior aspect. Now, some of these terms you already learned when we were looking at the humerus. So let's look at your master list. Ulna, what do you need to know? The olecranon. This whole part back here is the olecranon process. A lot of us just call it the olecranon. When you bend your elbow, if this elbow was bent all the way up and you have your elbow on a table, that is the olecranon that you're feeling. That pointy part of the elbow, if you bend your elbow right now and you feel that pointy part, you are feeling this, the olecranon right there. The trochlear notch, we've already done this. Here's the trochlear notch. Why is it called the trochlear notch? Because here we can see it over on this view. The trochlear notch is articulating with what part of the humerus? The trochlea, remember? The condyle trochlea, going all the way around the humerus. So there's the trochlear notch. The coronoid process. So here's our trochlear notch. This lip, this anterior lip of the trochlear notch, you can see it a little bit better, maybe right here. This anterior lip is the coronoid process of the ulna. The coronoid process of the ulna, remember where it's going into the humerus? It's going into that coronoid fossa that's in the anterior part of the humerus, just above trochlea. So when you bend your elbow, this coronoid process is going to be going up and going into that coronoid fossa of the humerus. So those you've already learned. But there's something we're going to show you now. Right here, this is going to be the lateral aspect of this ulna. This is the radial notch. The radial notch of the ulna. Now, the radial notch, why is it called radial? Because it's articulating with the head of the radius. Now, remember, the radius is right here. It's right next to Mr. Ulna. The head of the radius is going to be articulating with the radial notch of the ulna. So here I've put your medial bone, the ulna, next to its lateral bone, the radius. Here is the head of the radius, and it is articulating with the radial notch of the ulna right here. So you always need to know that if you need to figure out if it's a right or left bone, always know what part of the radius is anterior, what part is posterior. Find that radial notch. You know it's always going to be facing laterally. So it's going to be facing the radius, which is the lateral bone. So that's it for the proximal end of the ulna. If we go down to the distal end, there's not much down here. We've got this little knob right here. This is called the head. It's got the head of the ulna. Also has articular cartilage right here. And then we have this little point down here. This is the styloid process of the ulna. It's just this little projection. So the styloid process of the ulna. So the other thing you're going to need to know, here's the head of our ulna, and it's articulating here with the radius. So there's 2 points of articulation of the radius and the ulna. The distal articulation and the proximal articulation. Now in this distal articulation, the head of the ulna is articulating with the radius at the ulnar notch of the radius. So head of the ulna down here is going to be articulating with the radius at the ulnar notch down here. So let's see, let's just go back up here. See if we got everything. So here, just go through this again. Here's the articulation of the ulna with the humerus. This is the olecranon process. The olecranon upper lip is going to go inserting into that olecranon fossa. Here is the trochlear notch. It has articular cartilage. The trochlear notch of the ulna is articulating with trochlea, remember trochlea, of the humerus. And then we have the coronoid process, this lip, this little lip right here. The coronoid process of the ulna is going to be going into this coronoid fossa of the humerus when your elbow is completely bent. Here is the radial notch of the ulna articulating with the head of the radius. It's lateral bone. This is the lateral aspect. You always know it's lateral because the radial notch is always facing the lateral bone the radius. So now let's move on to the radius. So this is the proximal end. Probably figured that out by now. This is the head of the radius. We said the head of the radius is our most lateral bone, and it is articulating with capitulum right here. And the head of the radius is articulating with our ulna at this radial notch of the ulna. This is going to be important when we get into movements of the forearm. This head of the radius is actually rotating. It's kind of like spinning in that radial notch of the ulna. It's going to just kind of spin in there, and it's going to allow your forearm to do a special movement called supination and pronation. And we'll talk about that in when we get to our joints. But head of the radius kind of rotates in that radial notch of the ulna. What else do you need to know on the radius? We got the head, the radial tuberosity. The radial tuberosity is this thing right here, this bump right here. I always call it a radial tubercle because it looks more like a tubercle than a tuberosity, but they're calling it a tuberosity. So call it a tuberosity. That's the radial tuberosity, this bump right here. And what else do you need to know? The ulnar notch, which is at the distal end. We talked about the ulnar notch, which is right down here, which is, let me actually get rid of the ulna so you can see it better. So here is the ulnar notch down here. The ulnar notch has articular cartilage. The ulnar notch of the radius is articulating with the head of the ulna. Ulnar notch articulating with the head of the ulna. Also at the distal end of the radius is going to be this little pointy part. This is the styloid process of the radius. Now, if we were in a real classroom, I would point this out, that this anterior surface of the radius, down here, it's nice and smooth. This is always going to be smooth. One way to tell if it's the anterior posterior view. If we flip this around and we look at the back side, can't really tell it so much on this bone, but this is real rough back here. This is the posterior aspect of the radius. This is a rough and patch. Here we see the styloid process right here. And I think we about covered everything on the radius. The radius, your most lateral forearm bone. I'm going to show you something under here. There is lots of articular cartilage right here on the distal underbelly of the radius, because it is the radius that is going to be articulating with two of your carpal bones. We're going to do your carpal bones right now, but I want to let you know it is the distal end of the radius that is articulating with the carpal bones, two of them. So we finished the ulna, the medial bone, and the radius, the lateral bone. Now we're going to go on into the carpal bones. Now there are 8 carpal bones. Remember, carpal means wrist. So for my class, I only want you to know 3 of them because clinically, those are the 3 that are important. If you just look at the skeleton, you will notice that it is only the distal end of the radius that is actually touching any of the carpal bones. The distal end of the ulna, there's just going to be some connective tissue in through here, but there is no direct attachment or articulation with any of the carpal bones. So the carpal bones for my class that are most important clinically, number one, let's start with this guy. So this is the lunate, Lunate, the lunate. It is the lunate and the scaphoid that are articulating with the distal end of the radius. And it is the distal end of the radius, the lunate and scaphoid, that make up your wrist joint. That is your wrist joint, those three bones. The most common fractured bone in your body, in the carpals, not in your body, that's the clavicle, but the most commonly fractured carpal bone is going to be the scaphoid. Real important bone. There is a problem with healing of the scaphoid. If it doesn't heal properly, there can become a problem. And if you're interested in lawsuits, this is one of those bones. There's lots of lawsuits. You can just Google it, scaphoid fracture lawsuits. So the problem with the scaphoid is if you get a fracture through this bone, and there's a separation between these two aspects of the bone, there is only the blood flow to this bone is only coming from this end of the scaphoid. That's its blood supply. So if you separate the two bones here, and there's no connection between the proximal and distal part of the scaphoid, this part of the bone will die. So if this part of the bone dies, it's going to what they call necrose. It's going to die off. It's not going to be there anymore. You'll just have this little scaphoid down here. You'll have chronic wrist pain. The wrist joint's kind of important, so it's real important that if there's a fracture here, they follow it and make sure these two bones reconnect. So that's my little talk on these bones. These are important bones, lunate and scaphoid. The other carpal bone that I want you to know is this guy. This is the trapezium. So the trapezium is connected to, this is the thumb side. Remember, radial is always thumb side. This trapezium is going to be articulating with this. You're going to learn this shortly. It's the first metacarpal bone. And we say that the thumb swings from the trapezium. What does that mean? It means this little joint with the trapezium and this first metacarpal of the on the thumb side, when you do opposition, like you put your thumb over and touch your pinky, that's called an opposable thumb. That movement is allowed because of this articulation with the trapezium. So very important joint right here. Always remember the thumb swings from the trapezium. So for my class, the only bones you need to know, scaphoid, lunate. Those are on the first row of bones. And the second row of bones, the carpal bones, is going to be this guy, the trapezium. So that's it for the carpal bones for my class. Then we get down into the hand. Yay, we're almost done. So the next set of bones, if you're following your master list, are these. These are your metacarpals. M-E-T-A. Meta. What does that mean? Meta means after. Metacarpal. They come after our carpal bones. So nice name to have. And we have how many? We have five digits. We got 5 metacarpals. The way we're going to name these, this is going to be metacarpal number 1. The thumb is always number 1. Metacarpal number 2, metacarpal number 3, metacarpal number 4, metacarpal number 5. Easy wheezy. If on a lab practical I ask you, what's that bone? You would say metacarpal number 2. Always give the number of the bone. Remember, thumb is always number 1. So now we're going to get into our fingers, our digits, aka our phalanges. Remember you learned that word phalanges on the first day of class? So these are our digits. So same thing, everything on the thumb side is labeled number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. This is proximal phalange number 1. Proximal phalange number 2. Proximal phalange 3. Proximal phalange 4. Proximal phalange 5. But if we look at the thumb, we go, here's the metacarpal number 1. Here's proximal phalange number 1. And then there's this guy. There's only 2 phalanges. We have a proximal and a distal phalange on our thumb side. Proximal phalange 1, distal phalange 1. Proximal phalange 2, middle phalange 2, distal phalange 2. Middle phalange 3, distal phalange 3. Middle phalange 4, distal phalange 4. Middle phalange 5, distal phalange 5. So always remember the thumb phalanges, there's only a proximal and distal phalange. Everything else has a middle phalange. Do not call that middle phalange number 1. I'm not sure why some students do that, but they always do. Maybe because there's no middle phalange on the thumb, they put number 1 over here. Don't. Everything here is 2. Everything here is 3, 4, and pinky. Everything on the little finger is number 5. Got it? Got it. So we are done with the upper extremity. So next video is going to be the lower extremity bones.